During the Trojan War, Homer wrote about dozens of brave people whose names will live forever. But Agamemnon, the great leader and king of Mycenae, ended up more famous than Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, or Diomedes. The son of Atreus was the only person who could get all the other Greek chieftains to fight in distant places in Helen's honor. Agamemnon led the Achaeans and fought the Trojans for 10 years in front of the impenetrable wall. Despite all that went wrong, Agamemnon won the war, leading to Troy's downfall. The great Basilius amassed many of the war spoils, including the beautiful princess and prophetess who was the daughter of King Priam. Her name was Cassandra, so beautiful that the god Apollo fell in love with her. Agamemnon told her that he would take her as a slave to his court in Mycenae. She retorted, if he knew what awaited him in his homeland, he would never return to Greece. Although Cassandra was a true prophetess, Apollo cursed her for her rejection, and no one believed what she said. Agamemnon did not know that his wife Clytemnestra was ruling in Mycenae with her lover Aegisthus. The queen deeply hated Agamemnon because he killed her daughter Iphigenia to lead Greeks to war. Having had her favorite daughter killed because of her husband, she simply could not ever forgive him. The ships in Agamemnon's fleet were brimming with treasures when they returned to Greece. It appeared that he would be the only Greek leader whose fleet would return to Greece without damage. But as Agamemnon and his fleet were approaching the Peloponnese, a storm came up. Basilius asked the gods why they were punishing him, since he had done everything they told him to do during his 10-year stay in Troy. The prophetess Cassandra told him that the gods were not trying to punish him. Instead, they were trying to keep him alive, away from meeting his terrible demise in Mycenae. For the second time, Agamemnon said that Cassandra's gorgeous mouth was just talking nonsense, since he would reach the zenith of his glory as conqueror of Troy in Mycenae. The Mycenae palace learned that Agamemnon was returning from Troy. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra planned to get rid of the king before he could take his throne back. Agamemnon had 2 children, Electra and Orestes, who knew of their mother's relationship with Mycenae's acting regent. Agamemnon arrived in Mycenae as if he were Hercules' second coming. People cheered him as he walked through the legendary Lion Gate of Mycenae. He brought with him many valuable things from Troy. Clytemnestra knelt at Agamemnon's feet and thanked the gods for bringing back her husband in glory. But the whole scene was part of a plan. If the queen still cared about her husband, that vanished when she saw the beautiful Cassandra following him. Clytemnestra then thought about the words of Palamedes' father, the hero who was killed at Troy after being accused of treason. He said that the Achaeans' leaders had made their slaves their wives. Agamemnon thanked Aegisthus for taking such good care of his kingdom while he was absent. This showed that the feud between their families were over. Agamemnon embraced his children Orestes and Electra, who were small children when he left. The Mycenaean king told his wife that he had missed her very much and would like to sleep with her, but first he wanted to take a bath. After fighting for 10 years, Agamemnon felt that he could finally relax in his hot tub. Aegisthus then threw a net over Agamemnon, catching him completely off guard. The Greek king was attacked by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, who beat him to death. Since Clytemnestra was jealous of the young woman, she killed the slave Cassandra with 2 axe blows when she ran to see what was happening. The story of Basilius Agamemnon had come to a dreadful end, like many other descendants of Tantalus, but the fate of the children Electra and Orestes was still unknown. Aegisthus and Clytemnestra reigned supreme over Mycenae after Agamemnon's death, the great hero who led the Greeks to Troy. The slain king's supporters had already been silenced, for Aegisthus, during Agamemnon's absence, had placed men of his trust in the most important government positions. With the queen's support, he usurped the Mycenaean throne. But Aegisthus still had a matter to settle. Orestes, a 12-year-old child. He was Agamemnon's legitimate heir and would become a future contender for the throne. But Aegisthus did not want to kill the child immediately. for he knew what Clytemnestra was capable of, and he feared he would have the same fate as Agamemnon. But Electra overheard Aegisthus plotting with one of the minions on how to get rid of Orestes, making it all look like a mere accident. During the night, Electra executed a plan to deliver her brother from a terrible fate. They ran away so as not to be seen by the palace guards. She led him to a knight who was a loyal servant of Agamemnon, who would take the boy away from Aegisthus. Before leaving, Electra made Orestes swear that, as soon as he became an adult, he would return to take revenge on his father's murderers, and he did. Orestes was taken to Phocis, where the court of King Strophius, the boy's uncle, was located. The king raised Orestes as a son and prepared him to accomplish what he most desired, to avenge his father's death. Many years passed, and Electra prayed in Apollo's temple at Delphi that her brother would return and bring with him the god's vengeance. She could no longer bear to live under the rule of Aegisthus, who prevented her from marrying, lest she beget another heir to Agamemnon. On leaving the temple, she was approached by 3 young men who said they had news of Orestes, the brother she had not seen for years. Electra returned to Mycenae and threw herself into her mother's arms weeping. She carried the ominous news that Orestes had died in a chariot accident during the Olympic Games, and that his body would be brought by his friends to receive the proper funeral rites worthy of a prince. Clytemnestra appeared to have conflicting feelings towards her son's death, as Orestes' passing meant peace to the kingdom by no longer being a threat to Aegisthus. Electra informed Aegisthus of the arrival of Orestes' body, and he replied that it was the first time she had opened her mouth to say something pleasant. Aegisthus went quickly to ascertain whether that was really the prince's body, but he was surprised when he lifted the sheet covering Orestes' body. It was Clytemnestra's corpse, with her belly pierced by sword strokes. At that moment, Orestes drove a sword through the usurper's chest, consummating his revenge against the man who killed his father and stole his throne. The story of the return of the prince of Mycenae, who killed his mother and the murderer of his father, spread throughout Greece. Part of those who heard it considered the prince's act of killing his own mother to be ominous, and so he would still undergo a terrible ordeal. After consummating his revenge, Orestes' chest felt great pain. To avenge the murder of his father, the great Agamemnon, he had become the executioner of his own mother, and her and Aegisthus' blood stained his hands. 3 sinister figures appeared behind Orestes. They were the Aeneid, also known as Furies, entities that punished the murderers of kin. The Furies were 3: Tisiphone, the punishment, Megara, the grudge, and Alecto, the unnamed. They were goddesses of vengeance and had the underworld as their residence, where they spent their days punishing criminals. Orestes grew tormented by the Furies. Driven into a state of madness by the Aeneid, he fled Mycenae to the oracle at Delphi, seeking the help of the gods. Orestes had only the support of Pylades, prince of Phocis, who grew up beside Orestes while he was in exile, and to whom he promised the hand of Electra. Pylades, as a loyal friend, stood by Orestes in the most difficult periods. At the oracle of Delphi, facing the statue of the god Apollo, Orestes asked the shining deity for help. He considered the punishment unfair, and that his hands were not stained by the blood of innocents. Apollo appeared and said he would be by his side. Orestes had visited the oracle of Delphi as a teenager, being ordered to avenge the death of his father, cowardly murdered by his wife and lover. Apollo ordered Orestes to visit the city of Athens and the temple of its patron goddess, where he would find a courtroom set up to pass judgment, and Orestes set off with his friend toward Athens. The way to Ithaca was difficult. Orestes was still being persecuted by the Furies. In the face of such suffering, Apollo began to protect the prince of Mycenae, keeping the furious entities away. Orestes and Pylades finally reached their destination, the temple of the goddess Athena. Orestes knelt in front of the goddess's statue, saying that he was there at the behest of Apollo, the deity who had told him that Athena would provide a fair trial. Meanwhile, one of the Furies stated that, if justice was done, he would suffer eternally in Tartarus. Athena appeared and said that she would preside over Orestes' trial. The Aeneid would be the accusers and Orestes would have the right to a thorough defense. Outside the city of Athens, on Mount Ares, the trial took place before the Athenian populace. Orestes had the god Apollo as his defense attorney, while the Aeneid hurled terrible words against the Mycenaean prince. The leader of the Aeneid took the floor and opened the accusation, saying that the case was simple. Orestes had confessed to the crime of matricide. With his own hands, he had killed the mother who had always loved him. The law of gods and men was clear on the heinous crime. Apollo took the floor and said that Orestes had killed his mother, but Clytemnestra was not innocent. She and her lover Aegisthus had partaken in the murder of the lofty Agamemnon, the man who restored the honor of all Greeks by punishing the Trojans. The god asserted that the act had not been thoughtless. The prince had second thoughts and queried the oracle at Delphi, where he was told that he would have to punish the murderers, and in doing so, Orestes proved to be deeply God-fearing. The jurors seemed divided as to Orestes' verdict. When the votes were counted, the result was a tie. Athena stood up and said, as president of the trial, she would split the vote. The goddess asserted that she had listened carefully to the defense and the prosecution. When Orestes killed Queen Clytemnestra, he did not kill his mother, but his father's murderer. For this reason, she considered him acquitted of the charge of unjustified murder. Orestes fell to his knees, relieved, now free of the burden of one of the worst crimes committed by a human being. Defeated, the Aeneid bellowed angrily, saying that the new gods had thrown into the rubbish all the traditions built up over millennia. Orestes thanked the people of Athens for promoting justice in their land. He also stated that, from that day forward, the people of Mycenae would never war against the people of Attica as long as he lived, and cursed would be his successors if they disregarded such a promise. Orestes and Pylades left Athens. To appease the goddess of vengeance, Athena ordered a temple to be built where the Aeneid would be revered as promoters of the god's justice.
Tell me, Muse, about the man of many turns, who many ways wandered when he had sacked Troy's holy citadel.
This is how Homer invoked the Muses before singing the story of the hero Odysseus, brave warrior who, with his shrewdness, helped the Greeks to cross the divine walls of Troy. Among all the heroes who survived the ravages of war, Odysseus was the only one who had not yet returned home. On Mount Olympus, the gods gathered in an assembly. Zeus, high on his throne, spoke about how men blame all their ills on the gods, when in fact most of their misfortunes were the result of their own choices and follies, and for that they paid the price for their sins. At this point, Athena intervened and asked why Odysseus, the wise king of the island of Ithaca, even though he was God-fearing, continued to suffer away from his beloved homeland. The goddess lamented the hero's fate, who had been stranded for 7 years on the island of Ogygia. There, the beautiful nympho Calypso, daughter of Atlas, was keeping him on her island because she wanted to have him as her husband. Zeus explained that he was not responsible for Odysseus not having returned home yet, but rather Poseidon, who felt hatred for the hero ever since he pierced the eye of the god's son. But at that moment, Poseidon was in faraway Ethiopia, where he was worshipped. Therefore, he did not participate in the assembly. With the approval of the Council of the Gods, Zeus decreed that Odysseus had the right to return to his home. Zeus's favorite daughter was pleased, stating that she would go to Ithaca to find Telemachus, Odysseus's son. Zeus ordered Hermes, the messenger god, to go to the island of Ogygia to order Calypso to free Odysseus. Hermes put on his winged sandals and set off to fulfill the god's wishes.
The island of Ogygia was in the navel of the sea. It was a place where the vegetation grew exuberantly and the breeze blew gently, but strong waves pummeled its coastline. There, Calypso tried in every way to convince Odysseus to stay with her, and even offered him immortality. But Odysseus knew that he was just a mere mortal. It was wrong to desire immortality, for his place was not among the gods, but beside his family. Hermes entered the cave where Calypso lived, being received by the nymph with all reverence. The divine messenger informed Calypso that, by order of Zeus, she was to free Odysseus and secure the means necessary for his journey. The nymph was enraged, saying that the Olympian gods were envious, that they were not pleased with the happiness of the lesser deities when they relate to mortals. But Calypso knew that she could do nothing against Zeus's will. Sometimes her heart broke when Odysseus cried and sighed with homesickness. After delivering the message, Hermes left, and the saddened Calypso went to meet Odysseus. As usual, Odysseus was by the sea, thinking about his beloved Penelope. Calypso told him to stop crying, for he could finally return home. Odysseus, surprised and skeptical, looked back suspiciously, telling the nymph that he could stay if that was her will. The nymph laughed at the wily Odysseus, who, although he wanted to return home more than anything else in his life, knew better than to anger a deity. She told him not to worry, for she spoke the truth. His time on the island of Ogygia was coming to an end. Calypso pointed out to Odysseus the places where he could find the materials needed to build a raft, as well as explaining to him the design of the boat, so that it could withstand the waves. Odysseus did everything as he was ordered, and finally the transport that would help him reach his home was ready. The nymph handed Odysseus supplies for the journey, telling him that, if he knew the dangers that still awaited him, he would have chosen to stay. But the king of Ithaca would not waste that opportunity. Odysseus and Calypso said goodbye, and with the help of favorable winds brought by Calypso, Odysseus set off toward his destination. In his precarious vessel, Odysseus braved the great sea that separated the European from the African peoples. His goal was to return to the arms of his beloved wife Penelope and reunite with his young son Telemachus. On the island of Ithaca, the kingdom of the fearless hero was in danger, for it had been years since the king had left for the war of Troy. Almost everyone believed that Odysseus had died in his venture. Odysseus's palace was full of suitors who wished to betroth the queen Penelope and assume the vacant throne. The queen was no longer young, but still had incredible beauty. Young Telemachus, who was just a baby when his father left, was now a man. The suitors had chosen to stay in the palace, squandering Odysseus's fortune while waiting for Penelope to choose her new husband. Athena assumed the form of a seemingly noble man. In disguise, she entered the palace through the suitors who looked at the visitor with suspicion. Telemachus received the visitor with hospitality, just as Zeus had commanded men. The man said his name was Mentes, king of the Taphias, allies of Telemachus's father. Telemachus told the visitor about the chaos in his father's kingdom and how the suitors were squandering his inheritance. Finally, he asked if the visitor had any news of Odysseus. Mentes said he did not know Odysseus's exact location, but he was alive and doing everything he could to return home. The nobleman said that Telemachus should try to find clues to his father's whereabouts, for he was now a man and should take control of his destiny. Telemachus's heart felt great courage. Mentes assumed the form of a bird and took off. Witnessing that scene, the young man was sure that the gods were on his side. With the firmness and courage transmitted by the goddess, Telemachus announced to the suitors that the next day he would organize an assembly to decide the fate of his father's kingdom. Penelope realized that something had changed in her son. He was no longer a boy, and this filled her with pride. The next day, all the men of Ithaca gathered at the assembly called by Telemachus. The young man spoke about the chaos in his father's kingdom and scolded the suitors for depleting the missing hero's fortune. Antinous, one of the most insolent suitors, interrupted Telemachus, saying that the culprit for the whole situation was Penelope, who had deceived the suitors. Penelope had promised the suitors that as soon as she finished the shroud she was sewing for Laertes, Odysseus' father, she would choose her new husband. During the day, she would weave the shroud for her father-in-law, but as night fell, she would undo the work during the morning. Thus, for almost 4 years, she deceived the suitors until her trickery was discovered. The suitors claimed that they would hold consecutive banquets in Odysseus' palace until Penelope chose her new husband, even if it depleted Telemachus' entire inheritance. Telemachus threatened his rivals, warning that, because of this insult to hospitality, Zeus would ruin the suitors. 2 eagles suddenly began a flight in the skies, an omen of something important. The soothsayer Halitherses interrupted the omen and told the suitors that the king was returning, and the fate of his opponents would be terrible. Eurymachus, another renowned suitor, ignored the elders' words and said that, as soon as the assembly was over, they would again delight in Odysseus' possessions, for he was dead. Telemachus revealed the real reason for the assembly. He needed help to get a boat, men, and supplies for a trip to the island of Pylos in Sparta, where he would try to find clues to his father's whereabouts among the brothers-in-arms who fought alongside him at Troy. If unsuccessful, he would let his mother choose a suitor. No one supported the idea of Telemachus. Therefore, Mentor, the man Odysseus commissioned to take care of his family, scolded the people of Ithaca for showing such ingratitude to the family of the king, who was always kind and generous to them. The assembly was dissolved and Telemachus did not achieve his goal. At the seaside, Telemachus asked the goddess Athena for help in a prayer. She quickly answered. Athena assumed the form of Mentor and assured the young man that she would give him the means necessary for his journey, for she perceived that the prince had the courage of his father. Obeying Mentor's directions, Telemachus asked the old servant Euryclea for help in gathering supplies for the journey. Meanwhile, the goddess induced a deep sleep in the suitors so that Telemachus could escape in hiding. Telemachus boarded the ship that the disguised goddess had provided. Like his father, he set off bravely, leaving Ithaca behind to face the dangers and obstacles between him and his goal. After years trapped on the island of the nymph Calypso, Odysseus, guided by the stars, took his ship back to Ithaca. But Odysseus would not sail with impunity through the kingdom of Poseidon, who still had a lot of resentment for the hero, not having been at the divine assembly that ordered the return of the king of Ithaca. The god would pour out his wrath on him. The sea began to get rough, and Odysseus had to use all his skills as a sailor to fight the waves. The terrible ordeal imposed by Poseidon on Odysseus made him envious of the heroes who died at the gates of Troy. If he had fallen there, he would be exalted among men and not have the inglorious death that lay ahead of him. A great wave capsized his boat, throwing Odysseus into the water. In the waters, he struggled to emerge, but everything indicated that that would be his end. He was about to give up when a female figure appeared, and his will to live was renewed. Odysseus rose to the surface and managed to fill his lungs with air, while spitting out the salty water he had swallowed. He managed to cling to the remains of his ship, which had been destroyed by the waves. And over the wreckage, he saw a beautiful woman who could only be a goddess. The sea goddess was Leucothea, a deity who had been mortal. Therefore, she was very empathetic to the suffering of men. She asked Odysseus to remove his robes, which made swimming more difficult, while offering her handkerchief to Odysseus. Leucothea assured him that that handkerchief would help him reach dry land safely. Odysseus tied the handkerchief to his chest, as commanded by the goddess, and swam to the shore of the Phaeacians. Poseidon was pleased. That man had already suffered too many torments in the past years. It was time to allow the will of the council of the gods to be carried out. Poseidon would no longer pursue the king of Ithaca. Odysseus used all his strength to reach the beach and almost died when he was thrown by the sea against the rocks. But at last, he was protected on hospitable land. His first action on dry land was to return the handkerchief of the goddess Leucothea to the sea, she who saved him from certain death. The hero slept on a bed of leaves in the forest to regain his energy before seeking help in the unknown land. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of female voices, which seemed to be enjoying themselves. Among the trees, Odysseus saw a group of girls playing with a ball. Among them, one young woman stood out from the rest. The hero realized that she was a nanny to the other young women, and that this noble woman would probably tell him what place that was. But his nakedness was an obstacle. Odysseus approached the young girls, using a branch with leaves to hide his private parts. The girls were startled by that scene, except for the noble and beautiful young woman. Odysseus knelt before the girl and said, "I don't know if you are a goddess or a mortal. If you are a goddess, you seem to me to be Artemis, who stands out for her poise and beauty among the most beautiful nymphs in her retinue. If you are mortal, thrice blessed are your parents to birth a daughter who blossoms so splendidly." Flattered, the young woman said her name was Nausicaa, and decided to help the man, telling her servants to give Odysseus robes. Clean and dressed in a beautiful robe, Odysseus looked like another man, different from the castaway the youngsters had found. Nausicaa was captivated by that elegant and seductive man. She wanted to introduce him to her father, King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, thinking about the possibility of making him her future husband. The princess pointed Odysseus the way to the city of the Phaeacians, but did not accompany him, for it would not be right for her to appear with a man in the city. At the city's entrance gates, Odysseus prayed that the gods would protect him and not let another barbarian people keep him from his goal. With Athena's protection, the hero was able to make his way to the palace without being harassed for being a foreigner. Upon reaching the palace, he knelt before Queen Arete, asking for assistance in returning home. Touched, the queen asked the king to receive the visitor with all hospitality, as required by Zeus. The king decided to offer all his hospitality. Odysseus was given a bed, and the next day, great festivities were organized in honor of the gods. Athletic games were held to show how skillful and strong the Phaeacians were. Odysseus even showed his strength by throwing a discus. During the banquet held to honor the guest, the Aidos sang of the Greeks' achievements in the War of Troy. Odysseus listened to the poet with admiration, for he was certainly inspired by the Muses. He sang the deeds of the heroes in such detail that he seemed to have been there. Odysseus wept, remembering the war that had kept him away for so long from his beloved land and family. King Alcinous, who until then had not known that his guest was one of the heroes of the deeds sung by the Aidos, asked why those stories moved him so much. Odysseus said he would explain everything to the king, but he didn't even know where to start. The hero took a deep breath and finally revealed his identity. He said he was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who for 10 years had fought alongside the bravest men before the great walls of Troy. Everyone was astonished at the revelation. Odysseus said he would tell his hosts about the adventures and hardships that caused him much pain. It all started after he and his men left Troy behind. This is how Odysseus's adventures began. After 10 years of war, thanks to Odysseus's wit, the city of Troy had finally been captured and pillaged. The king of Ithaca and his men, after years of fighting before the walls of Troy, were ready to return home. Odysseus and his squadron of 12 ships were sailing alongside the squadron of the great hero Agamemnon, until they were separated by a great storm. The storm blew Odysseus's men off course, taking them close to the country of the Cicons. These people allied themselves with the Trojans during the war. being responsible for the deaths of many Greeks. His crew demanded revenge against their enemies. In a surprise attack, Odysseus and his men pillaged the city of Ismarus, killing the warriors who resisted and enslaving those who did not flee. But the invasion of the island by the men of Ithaca would not go unpunished. The men and women who fled the city ran to the neighboring towns and cities in search of reinforcements. Meanwhile, Odysseus tried in vain to get his men to return to the ships, but they were determined to celebrate the newly won spoils. That's when one of the lookouts warned that an army was approaching. Odysseus's battalion had more than 100 experienced warriors, with several years of fighting in Troy. They were not afraid to fight. The battle began, and Odysseus felt foolish to be fighting again in an unnecessary conflict, even after achieving ultimate glory in Troy. The men of Ithaca fought like lions against more numerous enemies, but the countless amounts of Ciconian warriors made victory impossible. Odysseus ordered a retreat, and his men fled to their ships. The ships quickly fled the lands of the Cicones, and each ship lost 6 brave warriors in vain. But the hero's adversities had only just begun. A strong wind tore the sails of the ships, leaving his vessels at the mercy of the sea currents. His men worked at mending the sails, wanting to find their way home as quickly as possible. With the sails already sewn up, they found an unknown island, heading for it to supply the ships with drinking water. On land, Odysseus ordered 3 of his men to scour the island to find out who the resident people were. The ships were already stocked, and the scouts had yet to return. Odysseus then led a search quest. The hero was unaware that his men had been welcomed by the natives and were entitled to taste an exotic food. They had been offered lotus flowers and fruits. When Odysseus met them, they were eating the lotus fruit with great satisfaction. A compatriot greeted him as if he were a foreigner and gave him the exotic fruit. Odysseus looked suspiciously at the fruit, which looked quite appetizing. The man, who had lived with his king for the past 10 years, seemed not to recognize him, and Odysseus realized that this could only be caused by some toxin in the fruit. The king of Ithaca tried to convince the men to return with him to the ships, but they wished to stay there, eating lotus for the rest of their lives. Odysseus ordered his men to forcibly drag their colleagues back to the ships, while they were begging to stay. These men were tied up and put back on the ships. The squadron departed, leaving the island of the Iodophagi behind, while its lotus-eating inhabitants waved, before eating the fruit that would make them forget about those visitors. Meanwhile, one of Odysseus's men was crying, for he wished only to eat the lotophagous fruit to forget all the horrors he had witnessed in the war. But Odysseus's men would encounter even more terrible images during their return home. Odysseus and his men spent several days without seeing solid ground in their heroic attempt to return home, when they finally found an island on the horizon. It was the famous island of the Cyclops, one-eyed creatures, sons of Poseidon, the mighty god of the seas. Odysseus wanted to meet the island's inhabitants, and chose 12 of his best men to explore the island with him. They found a large cave, and the sound of screeching sheep could be heard from inside. Upon entering the cave, Odysseus realized that this was the home of one of the beings that inhabited the island. Inside the cave, there was an enclosure with some sheep, amphorae filled with goat's milk, and bowls with fresh cheese made from it. Odysseus tasted some of the cheese and thought about stealing it, but decided to wait for the return of the cave dweller and negotiate with him. But the hero would regret this decision. The huge Cyclops appeared in front of the cave, bringing with him part of his herd that he had taken out to graze. Odysseus and his men hid, fearing for their lives. But the hiding places of the sailors were revealed when the Cyclops lit a fire in the center of the cave. Odysseus came out of his hiding place and introduced himself to the monster, saying who he was and what he was doing there by asking for hospitality. The Cyclops said that his name was Polyphemus, the most glorious of his race. He claimed that he owned no hospitality to inferior beings, for he did not recognize the laws of men. Polyphemus grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men by the legs and slammed them to the ground, killing them immediately. As if this weren't enough, the beast still devoured them completely. The mighty Cyclops moved a huge stone and blocked the exit of the cave. After that nasty meal, the Cyclops decided to sleep. Odysseus's men wanted to kill him while he slept, but the cunning leader stopped them, because it would be impossible to move the heavy stone blocking the cave exit. The next day, the giant took his sheep out to pasture, leaving the men locked in the cave. Odysseus, together with his men, planned a way to avenge the death of his colleagues. They found a large log of wood and sharpened one end. At the end of the day, the Cyclops returned, and after re-entering, closed the exit of the cave. Odysseus poured into a jar the wine from the wineskins of all his men to offer it to the one-eyed giant. Polyphemus drank with satisfaction the strong wine offered by Odysseus and liked the gesture. He told the hero that, as a reward, he would be the last to be devoured, and asked Odysseus his name. He replied that his name was Nobody, and that everyone knew him that way. Drunken Polyphemus felt an irresistible urge to sleep. Odysseus and his men took the makeshift weapon and prepared their revenge. They ran with the sharp stake toward the monster's one eye. The Cyclops woke up and screamed in pain. After hearing his brother's terrible screams, 2 other Cyclops appeared at the entrance to the cave. They asked who had done it, and Polyphemus shouted, "Nobody! Nobody has pierced my eye!" Since there was no one to punish, they returned to their homes. The next day, the blind Cyclops let the animals out to graze, but he did not expect Odysseus to use another trick. Clinging to the bellies of the strong rams, Odysseus and his men managed to escape Polyphemus's cave. When they were all out of the cave, they quickly ran to the ships. On the ship, Odysseus shouted at the monster, saying that being blinded was a deserved punishment for a criminal who disregarded Zeus's designs by devouring those who had asked for hospitality. Polyphemus pulled a large chunk out of a mountain and threw it in the direction of Odysseus's cries. The great rock fell near the ship of the king of Ithaca. His men begged him to stop taunting the beast, but Odysseus continued. He shouted again, saying that, when someone asked him who had pierced his eye, he should answer that it was the man who devastated the city of Troy, son of Laertes, the great Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. The furious Polyphemus threw another boulder at Odysseus's ship, and it grazed the ship of the Greeks. Odysseus walked away from the island of the Cyclops, regretting that he had lost some men, but excited that he had overcome a huge challenge. Polyphemus asked his divine father and begged Poseidon to punish the man responsible for piercing his son's eye. He asked that the god of the seas prevent Odysseus from returning home. If the gods so willed, he should wander the seas for years, arriving home without ship, treasure, and companions. Odysseus's haughtiness, which led him to mock the son of Poseidon, would cost him dearly, for he now had the god of the seas as an enemy. Days after leaving the island of the Cyclops, Odysseus's fleet found a floating island that was not attached to land. There was only a splendid bronze palace on top of a hill. The king of Ithaca and his men disembarked on the island, setting off in the direction of the residence of the island's inhabitants. Odysseus met Aeolus, the guardian of the winds, who cordially welcomed the visitors. During the banquet in honor of their illustrious visitors, Aeolus and his sons listened cheerfully to Odysseus, who narrated to them the great deeds of the heroes during the Trojan War. To thank them for the entertainment, Aeolus opened a large wineskin and placed inside it all the winds, except for Zephyr, which would blow quietly to guide Odysseus and his men to their home. The favorable wind drove the hero's ships close to home. After sighting the island of Ithaca, Odysseus could see the smoke from the chimneys. Relaxing for a moment, he entered the realm of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and started snoozing. Odysseus's men were unhappy to return home with virtually no spoils of war. They envied Odysseus for having received a big bag from the gods. They wanted to know what kind of treasures were in the bag. They imagined that there was a lot of gold, so they opened the wineskin. After they opened the bag, all the winds came out and seemed furious. Odysseus awoke, startled by the great noise made by the strong winds. The winds caused great waves and gathered storm clouds, pushing the ships far from home. Odysseus, feeling disillusion and frustration, thought of throwing himself into the sea and ending all that suffering, but eventually regained his sanity. They returned to the island of Aeolus seeking help, but they were driven away by the ruler. He would not disregard the will of the gods, who certainly did not wish Odysseus to return home. Odysseus and his men fought against the winds, which seemed to carry them further and further away from home. After a long time at sea, they found a new island. On it was a protected area, where almost all of Odysseus's ships could find shelter. Only the hero's ship was moored outside the bay, as there was no more room. Odysseus ordered 2 men to inspect the island and find out who its inhabitants were. They found a child, who was bigger than a normal adult, and asked him to take them to his ruler. They were taken to a large house, where a giant queen welcomed them. The queen called her husband, who was huge and had a menacing appearance. He grabbed one of Odysseus's men and devoured him immediately. His partner escaped and ran to the ships. Meanwhile, the king of the giants, known as Laestrygonians, called the others to hunt the little men. The giants attacked the men and their ships in the bay as they tried to escape. The giants grabbed the men and sank their ships, throwing huge stones. The men who were not devoured immediately ended up trapped to be eaten later. By failing to dock in the bay, only Odysseus's ship escaped the massacre. His fleet now consisted of only 1 ship. Everyone in it mourned the loss of the brave friends who had survived the Trojan War, but perished before terrible creatures. Odysseus's entire fleet, which had set sail from Ithaca for Troy, had been destroyed in his attempt to return home after the war. Only Odysseus's captaincy ship escaped the tragedy. After a long time of sailing aimlessly on the sea, they found a beautiful island. But this did not gladden the hearts of the men of Ithaca, for they were traumatized by their last experiences on the island of the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians. The men set up camp on the beach, but the soldiers' low morale left them inert and without the courage to explore the island. But Odysseus grabbed a bow and set off after a prey for dinner. Due to the grace of the gods, Odysseus found a small deer. Using his exceptional marksmanship, he brought the animal down with a perfect shot. As he was returning to the beach with the animal's carcass on his back, he spotted a puff of smoke on the other side of the island. The men of Ithaca were overjoyed to see the king return with precious food. But these smiles quickly vanished when Odysseus ordered the formation of an expedition to find out who lived on that island. The hero did not wish to be responsible again for sending more men to their deaths. Therefore, the chosen ones would be elected by the gods through a lottery. The group of men led by Eurylochus went out to find who oversaw the island. They found a beautiful palace, but the entrance was filled with wolves and lions, which terrified the men. But, to the explorers' amazement, these creatures seemed as docile as pets. Suddenly, one of the men heard the singing of a woman coming from inside the palace. A beautiful woman was singing as she weaved. She was Circe, daughter of Helios and Perse. She had an enchanting beauty. Circe stood up and welcomed her visitors, inviting them in. She asked the guests to share a magnificent feast with her. Odysseus's men enjoyed the splendid delicacies offered by the lady, while Circe filled their cups with a magic potion. Suddenly, one of the men tried to speak, and his throat emitted a horrendous animalistic sound. The terrified visitors began to undergo a metamorphosis. A large snout started to appear on their faces, and their hands were replaced by split hooves. Circe had turned all the visitors into pigs, and with her staff, she led them into the pigsty. But, as a precaution, Eurylochus had not entered the palace, suspecting a trap. He was an eyewitness to that grotesque scene. Eurylochus desperately told everything he witnessed to Odysseus, who promptly set out to rescue them. Eurylochus begged Odysseus not to go to Circe. He recommended that they leave that island immediately, before they were all turned into pigs or worse. But Odysseus felt it was his duty to try to save the few men he had left, even if it cost him his life, and he set off. On his way through the forest, he met a young man. This was Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Hermes related exactly what had happened to Odysseus's men. He said that the same would happen to him if he did not take precautions during his journey. The god gave the king an antidote to the sorceress's potion. He advised him to threaten her vigorously to make her submit once she brandishes the staff. Eventually, she would attempt to invite him into her bed. Odysseus was to accept and win her friendship to free his countrymen. But first, she would have to swear that she would not try to do him any more harm. Odysseus drank the antidote and proceeded towards the palace. Circe was excited by the arrival of yet another visitor, welcoming him kindly. She led Odysseus to a beautiful throne where he could rest and where he was served a refreshing drink. Odysseus took the potion offered by his hostess, who looked on excitedly as he drank all the liquid from the golden cup. Then Circe touched the hero with her staff and ordered him to head for the pigsty, for that was where the pigs were. But Odysseus was immune to her charms, and he pushed the staff away, threatening Circe with his sword. With a seductive look, the lady asked Odysseus to spare her life and invited him to share her bed. Odysseus said he would accept the invitation, provided she swore not to attempt his life or do any harm. Circe took the oath, and the king of Ithaca and the sorceress were united in the divine bed. The next day, Odysseus was very well treated by the nymphs, who cleaned and dressed him. Circe was sitting at the table, waiting for the king. A great feast had been served, but he said it would be unworthy to eat while his men lived in a dump like pigs. Circe went to the pigsty and used her powers to restore the pigs to their previous form. Odysseus was amazed by the scene, noting that his companions seemed to be younger and healthier than before. The men embraced and celebrated their return to their former form. Circe was magnanimous to the men who entered her domains. She invited them to stay until they felt ready to move on. Odysseus and his men stayed on Circe's island for a year, enjoying the hospitality of their divine hostess. But one day, the warriors of Ithaca pressed the hero to return home. Odysseus confessed to Circe his desire to leave. She replied that she did not want to keep him there against his will. But before he could head home, Odysseus was to visit one of the most frightening places in the world. The hero was to go to the realm of Hades in search of answers.
On the island of Circe, Odysseus and his men spent their last night before sailing off to a nightmarish destination. They were due to go to the terrifying realm of Hades to encounter the fortune-teller Tiresias' spirit and find out if it would be safe to return home. Elpenor, one of Odysseus' comrades, slept on the roof of Circe's palace to avoid the heat, but he would wake up dazed and, having forgotten that he was on the roof, he fell off the top of the roof, breaking his neck. Then Odysseus and his men grieved the loss of yet another shipmate, but they had no time to waste, and so they set off in their boat toward the kingdom of Hades. They landed at a place on the edge of the world, close to the land of the Cimmerians. That spot was shrouded in a thick mist. Once there, they disembarked, bringing the animals offered by Circe to be sacrificed. When they arrived at the exact place designated by the sorceress, Odysseus performed the sacrifice of 2 lambs, and their blood was poured into a pit.
Odysseus and his men proceeded to be surrounded by spirits who wanted to drink the blood inside the den. But Odysseus was advised to chase them away until Tiresias appeared. Much to everyone's surprise, between the spirits was Elpenor, the friend they had just lost. He still had not been buried, and so he requested Odysseus to promise him that he would grant him due burial honors. The Ithaca king assured him that he would do so. Next, the spirit of Odysseus's mother appeared. She had been alive when the hero left for the Trojan War, and the vision of his mother in that place broke the king of Ithaca's heart, and tears welled up in his eyes. Then old Tiresias appeared, who had been a master sage in life. He asked to drink from the blood of the pit Odysseus made. He quenched his thirst with the blood of the animals, and with blood still on his lips. Tiresias explained that Odysseus would encounter many more hurdles before he could return home. Poseidon harbored hatred for the hero for having wounded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. The soothsayer predicted that Odysseus would still be able to return home. But if his men disregarded the beasts of the god Helios, the king would get home alone on a foreign ship, as all of his comrades would perish on the way. But Odysseus was astonished to find Agamemnon there, the greatest leader of the Greeks during the Trojan War. He was assassinated by his wife after returning home from the war. There he also met the great hero Achilles, who appeared to have become embittered. Odysseus told him how his achievements in the Trojan War were reckoned and commemorated among men. But Achilles said that he preferred 1,000 times to be a meager peasant and be allowed to see the light of day than to be the lord of the world of the dead. He also wondered how his son Neoptolemus was doing. Odysseus told him that he battled in the Trojan War and had proven himself a true disciple of Ares, accomplishing great deeds. Several others of his battle brothers would appear, such as Patroclus, Ajax, and others. But the mission of Odysseus in that land was finished, and so he and his men returned to the ship, heading back to the island of Circe to accomplish the promise made to Elpenor. Once there, they laid their friend's body on a pyre so that his spirit could ultimately rest in peace. During the farewell banquet thrown by the sorceress, she would whisper in Odysseus's ear the horrendous dangers he was about to face. The hero and his men would soon confront the most dangerous things that the kingdom of Poseidon had to offer. After his run-in with the soothsayer Tiresias in the underworld, it was prophesied that Odysseus would succeed in returning home. But he would still face nightmarish challenges before that. The sorceress Circe warned Odysseus of the dangers he would still encounter, but the Ithaca king preferred not to fully disclose them to his comrades, for he feared their hearts would be seized with dread. The first challenge was the mermaids, hybrid creatures, but with an incredible power of seduction. Their song was irresistible to all who heard it, and attracted their victims to their damnation. Odysseus ordered his men to plug their ears with wax, so that they would be unable to hear anything at all. Favorable winds were driving them near the mermaids' island. But Odysseus was gripped by curiosity, and wanted the opportunity to hear such irresistible singing. He ordered his men to tie him rigidly to the ship's mast, and even if he gave the order, his men would not release him until they were far from the island. Towering over the rocks, the beautiful mermaids sang and waved, attempting to lure the men to certain death. Scattered around them were countless bones of those who had been bewitched. Odysseus cried out for his men to free him and lead the boat towards the rocks, but they paid no heed to his orders. The Sirens flattered the hero in their songs, who had achieved great things in the Trojan War, and promised to write songs that would make his deeds immortal. Odysseus pleaded with his men to set him free, but they only tied the hero even more strongly to the mast. It was only when they were already at a safe distance from the island that Odysseus's companions pulled him free. The king of Ithaca took a while to recover mentally from that desperate experience. But now they were faced with a deadly challenge, as they would encounter two of the greatest dangers of the ocean, Scylla and Charybdis. A gigantic whirlpool was attempting to pour all the water out of the seas. This underwater creature was trying to engulf any vessel that came within its reach. To avoid the monster, Odysseus ordered his men to steer the ship as close as possible to a cliff. However, nestled in a huge cavern encrusted in the cliff was Scylla, a gigantic, hideous beast. It had several heads and tentacles. Just the sight of it made the men desperate. The creature plucked the men from the ship's deck and tore them to pieces. Survival spirit was what kept the men rowing vigorously, avoiding being pulled by Charybdis and pulling themselves away from Scylla. Odysseus and his men dodged that death trap, but now they were only a handful of warriors when compared to the army that had traveled to Troy 20 years ago. Ahead of them lay the island of Thrinacia, the one which was to be Odysseus's last stopover before he could finally return home. Odysseus and his men were sailing near the island of Thrinacia, from whence they heard the mooing of the cows and oxen that lived there. Odysseus's comrades yearned for supplies and rest, but the king of Ithaca was told by Circe that that island might bring complete ruin to his men. He attempted to convince them to move away from the island. However, his men were greatly disgruntled, even to the point of mutiny. Odysseus consented to take them there, as long as they promised not to touch the cattle on that island, which was owned by the god Helios. They agreed and headed for the beach. Shortly after sheltering the ship in a cave to protect it from the winds, a storm raged over the island. Odysseus informed his men that they were to consume only the supplies offered by the sorceress Circe, while leaving Helios's animals in peace. Inclement weather and unforgiving winds kept Odysseus stranded on that island for months. The supplies were very close to running out. Odysseus said it was best for his men to try to fish and gather whatever berries and roots they could find, but to keep away from the sun god's oxen. While on one of his hunts, the hero reached the top of a hill. Feeling close to the gods, he asked them to help him. He felt as if the gods had sent him a peaceful sleep, and right there he took a nap. He would wake up smelling the distinctive aroma of roasting meat. Nearby, his men were grilling calf meat, as they had slaughtered the best animals to appease the gods' wrath. They would rather bear the risk of divine vengeance than the ordeal of starving to death. Odysseus was desperate to witness the scenario he had feared so much. The revenge of the gods would come soon. In heaven, the sun accused men of profaning his sacred cattle. He said that he would go to Hades to illuminate the dead, while the earth and heavens would no longer see his light. Zeus pleaded with Helios not to stop illuminating the world, as he would end the lives of those responsible for such a crime. The headwind ceased, and Odysseus and his men set off, leaving the island of Thrinacia behind. But the thunderbolts in the sky pointed to Zeus's foul mood. A powerful lightning strike shattered the shipmast, collapsing on the helmsman. Further lightning struck the ship, utterly destroying it. Many of Odysseus's men died by electrocution, while others drowned in the sea waters. Laertes' son survived by grabbing onto the planks of the ship's wreckage. He would be the only one not to have his body swallowed by the sea. He would drift for a while until realizing that the currents were taking him towards a dreadful fate. Odysseus was once again heading for the gorge of Scylla and Charybdis. The wreckage was being tugged by Charybdis's whirlpool, and his end seemed inevitable. But he managed to reach the branches of a fig tree that sprang up by the walls. Hanging from it, the hero waited until Charybdis had swallowed all the water, as he always did. The water flow reversed, and Odysseus jumped onto the debris spewed out by Charybdis. using the strength of his arms and legs as he attempted his best to distance himself from that place. For days Odysseus was adrift at sea, until he was carried to the shores of the Ogygia island, where the nymph Calypso lived. After describing his stay on Calypso's island and how he had arrived in the land of the Phaeacians, Odysseus concluded his adventures at the court of King Alcinous. Overwhelmed with emotion, Odysseus felt in his heart the pain of recalling that almost all of his companions who perished on his journey cried out for his name in despair before they took their last breath. While Odysseus was trying to return home, his son Telemachus had departed for the Greek region of the Peloponnese in search of his father. He had the goddess Athena by his side, disguised as a mentor. His first stop was Pylos, the kingdom of the wise old Nestor, a famous hero from the Trojan War. The old king and his 2 sons were making sacrifices to the god Poseidon. They invited the young man and his chaperone to join them in the ceremony. Telemachus introduced himself as Odysseus' son, and Nestor was happy to meet the young man his father had mentioned so much. Unfortunately, however, Nestor had no news of Odysseus. He only knew that the Ithaca king was one of the 4 great heroes who had not made it home safely soon after the war ended. The mighty king Agamemnon had been murdered by his wife and her lover. Ajax the Great had died on the seas due as a result of the god's rage, and Menelaus had been lost for 8 years before returning home, but he knew nothing about Odysseus' whereabouts. The wise Nestor recognized that Telemachus was quite a valuable person, for he had the goddess Athena by his side. He recommended that the prince of Ithaca meet with Menelaus, as he would know some news of his father. The king of Pylos asked his son to accompany Telemachus to Sparta, where Menelaus and his queen reigned. They arrived during the festivities of the betrothal of Princess Hermione, daughter of Menelaus and Helen, to Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. The 2 young nobles were received with hospitality by the king, although the latter was unaware of their identity. He was only fulfilling Zeus's designs. But Menelaus noticed on the young man's face the features of his former battle companion. The queen, once known as Helen of Troy, also recognized Odysseus' presence in his son's features. Telemachus introduced himself and told her the reason for his visit. Menelaus asked him to sit down, for he had a story to tell. Menelaus said that his departure from Troy was difficult, since the Greeks had angered the gods. So, like Odysseus, he was lost at sea for a long time. But the ships reached the Egyptian coast. On this piece of land, he was plagued by depression, until he was seen by a sea deity who took pity on him. The Nereid Eidothea told Menelaus what he needed to do to return home. He was to gather some men and ambush Proteus, a sea deity with prophetic powers. They were to seize him and release him only when he promised to answer their inquiries. Following Eidothea's orders, Menelaus found Proteus counting his seals before taking a nap. Menelaus and his men jumped on the god and grabbed him. He was strong and fought his way free of his attackers. Proteus had the power of metamorphosis and used it to assume the most diverse forms. Finally, due to the persistence of Menelaus, who would not let go of him, he surrendered to the wills of the Spartan king and promised to tell everything he knew. Proteus told Menelaus that if he wanted to return home, he should make a sacrifice to the gods to appease their anger. Menelaus asked about the fate of the other Greek nobles who had returned from Troy. He told of the tragedy of Ajax, but the news of his brother Agamemnon's death broke his heart, and the Spartan broke down in tears. The god also revealed the fate of his great friend, the king of Ithaca. Finally, Menelaus told Telemachus the information he had. Odysseus had sailed for a long time aimlessly throughout the Mediterranean Sea. He had been stranded for several years on the island of the nymph Calypso, but this would not be a permanent situation, for he was destined to return home. Telemachus told of suitors who were squandering his father's estate and wished to conquer his throne. Menelaus advised the prince to return home, for his father would need Telemachus's help. Together they would teach the suitors a lesson. Having left the land of the Phaeacians behind, King Alcinous made provisions for one of his ships to take the hero back to Ithaca. He would never forget his host's hospitality. Odysseus was gripped by a deep slumber and slept through the entire journey. When he reached Ithaca's beaches of Dexus, the sailors had no courage to wake him, so they disembarked him with the gifts offered by the Phaeacian king. When Poseidon heard that his enemy had finally reached his homeland, he was enraged, and the sailors who carried the hero would pay a high price for dishonoring the god of the seas. Just as they were concluding their return journey, the ship of the Phaeacians was pulverized by Poseidon, who in a gigantic form smashed it with his bare hands. Upon parting his hands, there was only a large boulder in front of the Phaeacians' harbor. They had become a rock, and from that day on, the Phaeacians never again assisted castaways. In Sparta, Athena warned Telemachus that it was time to return home. The suitors planned to trap him on his return. For that reason, he was to sail at night and not head for the port, but to the home of Eumaeus, the man who raised him in Odysseus's absence. Eventually, Odysseus woke up and had no idea where he was. He feared that he was again in an unknown foreign land fraught with danger. It was then that a young shepherd boy appeared, and Odysseus inquired what place that was, and the young man said Ithaca. Cunning Odysseus, to disguise his identity, made up a story full of details which gave him a new biography. Meanwhile, the young man listened to his story with a smile on his face. At this point, the young man took the form of the goddess Athena, who said that his story was of unequaled astuteness, and that it would almost fool even the goddess of wisdom. The goddess told him that he would have to seek out the loyal Eumaeus and bring himself up to date with the situation in his kingdom. But first, he needed a disguise. The goddess arranged for Odysseus to adopt the form of an old beggar, and he made his way towards the house of Eumaeus, the swineherd. Eumaeus abided by the duty of hospitality and welcomed the beggar with warmth. The pig-keeper told him about how the suitors squandered Odysseus's fortune and intended to kill Telemachus and betroth the queen Penelope. That was when footsteps were heard approaching the house of Eumaeus. Odysseus understood that the dog gave no alarm, and so it must have been someone known. The young Telemachus came through the door and was greeted cheerfully by the pigman, who said the prince's name. Odysseus's jaw dropped, and his eyes grew wide at the sight of his grown son. More than 20 years had passed since he had last seen him. Telemachus told the pigman he ought to go to the palace to tell him secretly about his return. As soon as the pigman left, the figure of the goddess Athena appeared behind Telemachus, but only Odysseus and the dogs could see her. She told Odysseus that the time had come to reveal himself. Athena restored Odysseus to his original form, much to Telemachus's astonishment, who believed that the old man could only be a god. Odysseus told them that he was not a god, but actually his father, who had been missing for a long time. Father and son embraced, and many tears were shed from Telemachus and Odysseus's eyes. Odysseus wondered who and how many were the suitors who were trying to claim his rights. The young man said that there were dozens, and victory over them would be almost impossible. Odysseus instructed his son not to tell anyone about his father's return, not even Eumaeus and his mother. He said he should fear nothing, for Zeus and his beloved daughter were on their side and would lead them to glory. Again in the form of an old beggar, Odysseus went to the palace to beg among the suitors and know who they are and what their enemies had been planning. Odysseus went to Ithaca's royal palace alongside the swineherd Eumaeus, but before he reached the palace, he had an unexpected reunion. Lying on the ground was old Argos, Odysseus's dog, to which he had devoted much affection and time to turn it into an excellent herding and hunting dog, when the animal was still a puppy. Upon seeing the beggar approaching, The dog raised its ears and wagged its tail. Even 20 years later, the animal recognized its master immediately and would have run to him if it had not been too weak. Odysseus asked Eumaeus why the animal was so badly treated. The swineherd replied that the dog was unbeatable at herding and hunting. But, like the kingdom of Ithaca, it had lived through years of neglect, and so there were no signs left of its glorious times. Odysseus knelt down and shed a tear upon meeting his old and loyal friend again. After 20 years of waiting for Odysseus's return, Argos ended its vigil and could rest on the other plain. Its master had returned to take care of what was his. Odysseus entered the palace. Dozens of suitors were eating and drinking at the expense of the king of Ithaca's estate. The hero begged among the suitors to identify the good and bad. But Antonius, the most prominent of the suitors, wanted to expel the beggar from the palace. Odysseus retorted, saying that he ate and drank at another man's expense, but still refused to share even a fraction. Outraged by the visitor's insolence, Antonius threw a wooden seat at the beggar. Despite the powerful impact, Odysseus was strong and absorbed the blow without any reaction. The other suitors told Antonius that he had not been correct. Sometimes the gods would disguise themselves to test men's hospitality, and their revenge could be grim. Odysseus sat on the floor to eat the leftovers the suitors dropped off. Suddenly, Aeneas entered the palace, a well-known local beggar. He was burly and aggressive. He was irritated to see another beggar occupying his place. He advanced against Odysseus, telling him to leave, for it was not his place there. Odysseus told him not to overreach. Despite his age, he could still beat him up, so they could both be left alone in the palace. The suitors were entertained by the bickering between beggars, challenging them to fight each other. Antonius replied that only the winner of the fight would have the right to beg in the palace, as the other would have to leave. With no alternative, Odysseus accepted the fight. Aeneas was strong, but he was surprised to see Odysseus's muscles when Odysseus removed his cloak. The burly beggar set out to attack Odysseus, but he was knocked out by a single blow to the neck. The victorious Odysseus was cheered by the suitors, who had fun at the beggar's expense. The disguised king was greeted by one of the several suitors. Odysseus, realizing that he was not a bad person, warned him to leave the palace to escape his wrath, but the young man did not listen to him. Queen Penelope suddenly appeared. Thanks to the goddess Athena, who bathed her with ambrosia, she looked beautiful. Odysseus was delighted to see his wife again after 20 years. Although she no longer had her youthful features, she still retained an enormous beauty. But Penelope's stunning gorgeousness also aroused the suitors' desire. Antonius said that their patience was running out. Therefore, the next day, she was to choose her new husband. Odysseus talked with Telemachus and asked him to remove from the main hall all the weapons displayed on the walls. In this way, they would proceed with their revenge. While the young man was removing the weapons, he was questioned by a suitor who asked him what he was doing. Telemachus said that the weapons were being removed to be cleaned and polished. After all, they had not been maintained for many years. Meanwhile, Penelope questioned the visitor to learn more about him and to obtain possible information about her husband. The disguised king said that Odysseus was about to return, and Penelope wept with emotion. In gratitude, the queen asked her old servant Euryclea to wash the visitor's feet. To the old maid's surprise, she recognized an old scar that the king of Ithaca had suffered in a hunt when he was young. Euryclea knew that that man could only be Odysseus. Odysseus contained the maid so that she would not blow his cover. She promised the king that she would keep the secret, even from the queen. Penelope told Odysseus about her dream. 20 geese were roaming and messing up the palace courtyard, and she was forced to feed them. Then an eagle appeared and killed all the geese. The beggar told her that her dream could not be clearer. Odysseus would return and pour out his terrible vengeance on the suitors. But sadness plagued Penelope's heart. With the arrival of the goddess of dawn, the time would also come for her to choose a match among the suitors. The day came when Penelope would finally have to choose her new husband among the suitors. They were already once again ravaging Odysseus's estate, feasting on his goods. Inspired by the goddess Athena, Penelope came up with Odysseus's bow. She would set suitors a challenge, which was to be overcome by whoever wanted to be her husband. They were to bend Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through the hole of 12 axes lined up. Telemachus asked to be the first to try. If he achieved that feat, his claim to the throne would be further legitimized. The young man tried 3 times to bend Odysseus's bow, but without success. On the 4th attempt, just as he was about to succeed, Telemachus looked at his father and understood the message in the man's gaze. He gave up and said he couldn't do it. The suitors began to try to bend Odysseus's bow. One after another, they failed. Odysseus revealed his identity by showing his scar to the pygmy swineherd Eumaeus and his servant Philetus, who had always been very loyal to the king. The 2 subjects were very excited to see Odysseus again. He asked them to warn the maids and the queen. They were to lock themselves in their rooms, and the palace doors were to be bolted. Then the 2 main suitors tried to bend the bow. Eurymachus failed like all the others, and Antonius, even though he used tricks to try to bend the bow, also failed. Antonius told the suitors to leave the task until the next day. That way, they could go back to feasting at Odysseus's expense for one more day. At that point, Odysseus, assuming the form of a beggar, asked them to let him try to bend the bow. The suitors were outraged by the beggar's insolence. If he succeeded in bending Odysseus's bow, they would all be humiliated, and their reputation would be ruined. Telemachus bravely opposed the suitors, telling them not to disregard the designs of the gods, which required that guests be treated properly, and that the beggar would have the right to try. Eumaeus gave the beggar the bow, allowing him to try. To everyone's astonishment, Odysseus managed to bend the bow with ease. The disguised king took a deep breath and aimed. The perfect shot went through the 12 axes, to the disbelief of the suitors. The beggar said that if Apollo was favorable to him, he would manage to hit a target that would leave the suitors even more shocked. Odysseus shot an arrow at Antonius, who had a cup in his mouth. The arrow pierced the cup and struck the villain's neck. The king of Ithaca revealed himself to the suitors. At that moment, due to Athena's blessings, Odysseus was glorious, as in his golden days of bravery in Troy. His son Telemachus, with spear and shield, stood beside him. Eurymachus, realizing the mistake he had made, tried to negotiate and guaranteed that all of Odysseus's dilapidated possessions would be returned in time. Gold and bronze would be offered in abundance until his anger was appeased. But the rightful king of Ithaca said that all the gold in the world would not stop his vengeance. Eurymachus advanced against Odysseus, drawing a dagger, but was killed by an arrow shot by the king. Odysseus's great battle against the dozens of suitors began. His enemies were unarmed, for Telemachus had hidden all the weapons that had been left exposed. Odysseus did not waste any arrows. As if inspired by Apollo, the silver bow archer, he shot down the suitors one after another. The arrows ran out, but there were still dozens of enemies in the hall. Telemachus was defending his father's flank with great bravery and ferocity. Odysseus and Telemachus were at a great disadvantage. Realizing that Odysseus was beginning to falter, Athena encouraged him and told him to remember that at Troy, he faced and defeated a greater number of enemies more skillful and fearless than the suitors. Inspired by the goddess, Odysseus, Telemachus, the swineherd, and faithful servant Philetus fought against the suitors, eliminating them one after the other. The goddess shielded them against any mortal blow. Odysseus's victory was absolute. All the suitors were dead. The palace hall was filled with corpses, and there was a pool of blood on the floor. The old maid, at Odysseus's behest, brought Queen Penelope to the reunion, but she could not believe that her husband had returned. Only a god could have overcome so many adversaries. She remained silent before her husband, whom she hadn't seen for 20 years, without looking him in the eye. Odysseus, disappointed by the cold reception from the suspicious queen, demanded that they tidy his bed, for he wanted to rest. Penelope decided to test him and asked the servant Euryclea to take Odysseus's bed to another room. Odysseus, realizing how cunning his wife was, said that such a thing was impossible. He had built the bed for the couple using an oak tree. It would be impossible to move it because of its great weight. Penelope's eyes sparkled at that moment, for only Odysseus could know the details of how the bed had been designed. Penelope threw herself into the arms of her beloved husband, for whom she had faithfully waited for his return for 20 years. They went to the couple's bedroom to make up for lost time. During the night, Odysseus told Penelope much of his adventures. On orders from Athena, Aurora, the goddess of dawn, took her time to appear so that the couple would have more time for themselves. As the new day dawned, Odysseus felt he had returned to the place he should never have left. His place in the world was not beside great kings or gods. It was there, beside his beloved and faithful wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus, who gave him such pride. Following a request from the Roman Emperor Octavian Augustus, the great poet Virgil, who had been inspired by the Muses, recounted the adventure of the most famous Trojan hero, whose fame and glory were exceeded only by the great Hector, Prince of Troy. This hero's name was Aeneas, and his achievements would be echoed for millennia. After Hector's death at the hands of Achilles, Aeneas was given command of the Trojan armies that had been fighting the Greeks for 10 years in front of the Trojan Wall. However, the gods finally appeared to favor the Trojans when the Greeks, having failed to overcome the sacred walls of Troy, set sail from their shores. All they left behind was a massive wooden horse as an offering to the gods. The great horse was carried as a trophy into the city of Troy itself, and a major celebration began to commemorate the great Trojan victory over the invading forces, putting a stop to a decade of conflict. In the still of the night, the bravest Achaean heroes emerged from the belly of the wooden horse and, shielded by the shroud of darkness, stormed and surprised the small garrison protecting the Trojan gates. Once the gates were open, thousands of Greek soldiers, who were in hiding, invaded the city and started the takeover and destruction of Troy. The streets of Troy witnessed a bloodbath like never before. Women, children, and the elderly were shown no compassion and were slaughtered with swords. Aeneas was sleeping peacefully in his room when the Greeks took the city. In his dreams, however, he was visited by the spirit of the glorious Prince Hector. The magnificent son of Priam told Aeneas to wake up because Troy had been invaded. Hector told him that it was his responsibility to protect the precious Trojan tradition, and that he should take the sacred objects of Troy with him and find a new city with sturdy walls to protect them. Aeneas was appalled as the city he had fought for years burned to the ground before his eyes. It was now a doomed place. Aeneas donned his armor and went off to fight the Achaeans who were pillaging the glorious city. He and his men offered strong resistance to the Greeks, preventing them from advancing for a while. But the swarm of invaders was too much for so few men to stop, and realizing that Troy's fate was sealed, Aeneas pulled back, as it was not his fate to die fighting inside the city of Troy. Aeneas rushed to fetch his wife Creusa and his son Ascanius, with whom he ran to save his old father. When he met the old and maimed Anchises, Aeneas tried to convince his father to leave Troy with him and fulfill his destiny of protecting Trojan tradition and culture. But his father had no intention of leaving his beloved country behind and living out his last days in exile. That was when a small flame rose above Ascanius's head, a clear sign from the gods. Anchises understood that it was the role of his family to preserve all the memories of their ancestors. He gave in to his son's pleas and decided to follow him wherever he went. Aeneas had to carry his crippled father on his back. Since he had been struck down by a thunderbolt from Jupiter for his pride, there was chaos in the Trojan streets, and Aeneas attempted to lead his family to the meeting point agreed with the other men who were trying to flee Troy.
At that moment, a panicked crowd caused the hero to become separated from his wife. This would be the last time Aeneas would see his wife alive. Aeneas managed to reach one of the secondary gates that would allow him to escape from Troy, but he realized that his wife had not kept up with him, and in despair, he decided to go back to search for her. It was then that the spirit of Creusa appeared and told Aeneas that her fate was not to follow them, for she was already dead. She asked him not to look for her and to continue on his path, where Aeneas would find greatness and glory. Ascanius wept in his father's arms, begging for the return of his mother, but there was nothing that could be done. Now Aeneas had to gather the surviving Trojans and devise a new plan for their future. Gathered at the foot of Mount Ida, Aeneas, his family, and the last remaining Trojans came together. Anchises reminded everyone of the ancient prophecy that said Aeneas would be the heir to the Trojan tradition, and that he was destined to found a new city where the descendants of Troy would multiply and conquer many lands. Aeneas would lead his people toward the unknown, in search of the destiny promised by the gods. This path would be filled with adventures and challenges. The departure of Aeneas and the Trojans in search of a new beginning marks the start of one of the most epic journeys in history. Thus begins the Aeneid, the founding story of a civilization that would leave its mark on history due to the greatness of its people. Following the fall of Troy, Aeneas guided a band of refugees in search of a new land, where a prophecy would be fulfilled that he and his descendants would find a second Troy, which would eclipse its predecessor in glory and splendor. They arrived on the coast of Thrace, and as soon as they stepped ashore, he decided to build an altar to them and to collect offerings and present them to the gods as a sacrifice. When Aeneas picked wildflowers to adorn the altar of the gods, he was surprised to see blood dripping from the stems of the plucked flowers, and was afraid he was violating the garden of a dryad. But the truth was even sadder. The spirit of Polydorus appeared before him, a young Trojan prince who lived in Thrace until he had been captured by Ajax of Salamis and taken to Troy, where he was stoned outside the Trojan gates. His spirit returned to Thrace to rest in the last place where he had been happy. The boy's ghost urged Aeneas to leave that land, as the Thracian king was no longer a Trojan friend. He would only find ruin if they stayed on those parts. Before leaving Thrace, Aeneas held a ritual in honor of the prince whose life had been cut short so early. Facing enemies on almost every side, the Trojan survivors were unsure if there was any land that would welcome them, and so was the goddess Leto, who wandered for a long time in search of a place that would accept her children Phoebus, Apollo, and Diana as their homeland. They headed for the sacred island of Delos. There, Aeneas and his old father sought answers from the oracle of Apollo. They were greeted by the king of Delos, who was also the chief priest of Apollo's temple. Aeneas and his father left Delos after having heard the oracle, telling them that they would have to make their way to the land of their remote ancestors. Anchises pointed out that they would have to go to the island of Crete, as it was from there that their ancestors had set out to found the city of Troy. Once in Crete, they founded the city Pergamon, and it appeared that they had found the promised land. There they built temples and palaces, but their true destiny was not to live on the island where the great Jupiter had been raised. A terrible drought devastated the crops, and disease began to spread among the Trojans. Many of them died during these harrowing days on the island of Crete. The people appeared to their leaders for an answer, but Aeneas failed to find a solution to their plight. He ordered them to get ready, as they were to return to the island of Delos in search of an answer. However, that same night while he was sleeping, Aeneas was paid a visit by the Trojan gods, among whom was Teucer, his ancestor who had given rise to the Trojan lineage. The visitors told Aeneas that they were not welcome in Jupiter's sacred lands, as the great god knew that his wife Juno loathed the Trojans with all her heart,
and that such hatred would bring misfortune to all the peoples who lived in Crete. The deities informed him that the Trojans had come to the lands of the wrong ancestors. Hesperia was where they would find their home. It was from there that the glorious Dardanus, one of the founding fathers of Troy, had set out. The next day, Aeneas instructed everyone to get ready, as he had been visited by the gods and they would change their course. Aeneas was to lead his fleet towards the lands of ancient Hesperia, now known as Italy. Aeneas and the Trojans were on the high seas once again, bound for the land that had been promised to them. But 3 days of severe storms blanketed the skies, and without the stars to guide them, their helmsman Palinurus seemed clueless as to where they were heading. However, the Trojans managed to find a safe harbor to disembark on the island of Strophs, not knowing that it was home to cursed creatures. Aeneas's men hoped that the land would be welcoming, as they quickly found wild goats to eat. Before they could feast on goat meat, they made a sacrifice to Jupiter, who had brought the hospitable land into their path. But little did he know that the great god was avoiding aiding the Trojans for fear of the wrath of his wife Juno, who was the Trojans' enemy. That was when one of Aeneas's men raised the alarm, as 3 hideous winged creatures were rapidly approaching. These were the loathsome Harpies, half-woman, half-bird creatures who, since their defeat by the Argonauts, had taken up residence on the island of Strophes. They were filthy things, and their rot contaminated all the food. Again, Aeneas's people had to hunt and cook goat meat. But once more the Harpies came and spoiled the Trojans' meal. Aeneas took it upon himself to stash his weapons in the undergrowth and ambush the Harpies. When the Harpies returned, Aeneas and his men stood ready to fight them. The struggle was hard fought, and both sides fought bravely. But Aeneas's men were not nearly as mighty and resilient as the heroic children of the gods who accompanied Jason, and so they were no match for the Harpies. Before they left, one of the Harpies even cursed them for killing their cattle. They told them that they would have to suffer and starve and eat their own tables before they could settle in the land that the gods had promised them. Aeneas's fleet was now in Italian waters, and everything suggested that they were nearing their long-awaited destination. However, a great danger loomed ahead. They met with the perilous Charybdis, a gigantic creature living underwater who swallowed the seawater and created an enormous whirlpool, engulfing everything close to it. Aeneas's ships squeezed through the rock walls to escape as far as possible from the enormous whirlpool, and fortunately took the side opposite the cave of the monster Scylla, who ambushed the ships nearing its cave. Having succeeded in escaping unharmed from such danger, they headed for the coast of the island of Sicily. They encountered the gigantic Mount Etna, a mighty volcano that spewed fire and lava. According to the myths, Zeus had thrown a huge mountain on the monster Typhon, who was imprisoned under the volcano, and the eruptions showed that the monster was extremely angry. Aeneas and his father landed once again in unknown lands, but bold Anchises was beginning to show signs that the exhausting journey was costing him dearly, and his health was declining day by day. The Trojans were surprised by a visitor during the night, sweating in rags, and they realized that he was a Greek from the way he spoke. He knelt before Aeneas and pleaded for help and forgiveness, as he was one of Odysseus's men, king of Ithaca, having fought against the Trojans in the Trojan War. He told them that he had been left behind on the island of the Cyclops when Odysseus passed by. He had failed to join Odysseus when he escaped from the Cyclops Polyphemus, as he was sick and wounded, and had been hiding from the terrible Cyclops that lived on the island ever since. Then the huge one-eyed monster emerged, but luckily for the Trojans it had been blinded by Odysseus and did not notice the presence of his men. Aeneas and his crew managed to make as little noise as possible so as not to attract the Cyclops' attention and embarked on their ships, bringing the Greek Agamemnon with them. However, as they set off again, Aeneas noticed that his parent was drawing last breath. the great lord of the Dardanians was leaving the duty of carrying on the legacy of his people in his son's hands, and so died old Anchises, the man once adored even by the goddess of love. Aeneas arranged a funeral to honor the great lord of the Dardanelles, and Aeneas and his son Ascanius were now the only living members of the Trojan royal family, once so powerful and glorious. At last, Aeneas and his men were nearing the land promised to them by the gods. But one deity had made no such gift promises to the Trojans. She was Juno, known to the Greeks as Hera, the wife of the supreme god. She was still extremely hostile towards the Trojans, and not even the utter destruction of their glorious city could appease the goddess's wrath. Aeneas and the Trojans still had many trials ahead of them. Juno commanded the wind gods to strike the Trojan ships and churn up the seas with their blasts. The previously tranquil sea looked as if it had revolted against the Trojans. The heavy winds ripped at the ship's sails, and the enormous waves menaced to capsize the boats and throw their men into the sea. Neptune, the god of the seas, was angered by Juno's meddling in his domains, having tossed the seas into turmoil without checking with the supreme lord of the realm. The mighty god stunned the wind deities with his trident, and the sea waters quieted down, saving Aeneas from a devastating fate. Several ships disappeared in Juno's chaos, but Aeneas and most of his vessels found their way to the North African coast. They were unaware that they had reached the kingdom of Libya, a land governed by immigrants from the Phoenician island of Tyre. Aeneas, making use of his bow and arrow, shot 6 deer-like animals of the local fauna and managed to provide food for his people who were starving. Venus, the goddess of love and mother of Aeneas, knelt before Jupiter in the dwelling of the gods and asked him what her son had done to deserve such a harsh punishment. The supreme god assured her that she had nothing to worry about. Notwithstanding the fury of his wife Juno, he would guarantee that everything prophesied to Aeneas would come true. In Italy, he would lay the foundations for a nation that would outshine all others. Julius Caesar and Octavius Augustus would emerge from this people, standing out among all the others of their time, with their names reverberating throughout history, much like the great heroes of Hellas. Mercury, the swift messenger god, headed to Carthage at Jupiter's command to notify them of the presence of Aeneas and his people. It was the Carthaginians' duty to greet their visitors warmly. Aeneas, meanwhile, was out on one of his hunts when he stumbled across the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, wearing the garb of a huntress and possessing a divine aura. He greeted her with the utmost respect. Although she was not the goddess of hunting, Diana, as her hair was as black as night, she could only be a goddess. He was right. She was his mother, masquerading as a Libyan huntress. She told him where he was, and about the people who lived there. Most importantly, she told him about Dido, the queen of Libya, who reigned over the land from her throne in Carthage. The gorgeous Queen Dido was the daughter of the Phoenician king, but when her brother took the throne of Tyre and murdered her husband to rob her of all her wealth, Dido fled north. She escaped to North Africa, carrying all of her husband's vast wealth with her to prevent it from being stolen by her ruthless brother. Dido went on to settle these distant lands, and with the blessing of the goddess Juno, grew what had once been a small hamlet into a magnificent city. Juno is said to have planned for Carthage to be the bedrock for the foundation of a universal empire. After the huntress told Aeneas about the queen, she told him that, according to the flight of the birds, one could infer that, when Aeneas got back to his base, he would be in for a good surprise. Several swans were flying back together after being dispersed by an eagle. As the huntress turned to leave, Aeneas could smell a sweet, unmistakable scent from her hair. This was his divine mother's perfume, and thus he knew that she was still watching over him. Upon returning to his people, Aeneas spotted numerous ships on the horizon which had been lost. The gods seemed to be on his side once again. Aeneas would now have to follow his mother's advice and go to Carthage to meet Queen Dido. Aeneas and some men headed for the city of Carthage, carrying gifts for Queen Dido, who ruled over the whole region. The first time the Trojan leader and the queen saw each other, both were blown away by each other's beauty. Dido was gorgeous, and Aeneas was the son of Venus and the charming Aeolus, whose build and features were exceptionally alluring. The goddess Venus kept an eye on everything, worrying about her beloved son's fate, as Carthage was patronized by the goddess Juno, and she was a Trojan enemy. She asked her other son Cupid, the god of passion, for help. He was to disguise himself as Asanius, Aeneas' son, making sure that the queen fell in love with his half-brother. Dido and Aeneas had much in common. Both were descendants of powerful royal families and widows of partners who had been brutally murdered. They too ended up in exile with the mission of founding a great civilization. Carthage was already growing rapidly, but Aeneas' new city was only a far-off dream. Aeneas was extremely proud to present his son Asanius to the queen. Dido expressed her affection for the boy and asked him for a hug. Cupid, in disguise, seized the opportunity to strike the queen of Carthage with one of his golden arrows, sparking in her a passionate desire for Aeneas. Throughout the night, the queen could not stop thinking about the handsome host from distant lands, but she had made a vow not to get involved with any other man following her husband's death. The following day, Dido invited Aeneas to go hunting. While the queen looked delicate, she was an accomplished archer and impressed Aeneas with her accuracy. However, heavy rain led the pair to seek shelter from the storm, and they took refuge in a nearby cave. Far from everyone's eyes, Queen Dido declared her passion for the Trojan prince. Aeneas eventually surrendered to the seductive power of that beautiful woman. Aeneas and Dido started to foster a stealthy love affair, but this affair did not evade the watchful eye of the goddess Juno. Juno went to Venus and suggested bringing an end to the hostilities between her and the son of the goddess of love. As a way of sealing this pact, she proposed that Dido, her protege, and Aeneas join forces in a powerful alliance. But Venus was suspicious, as Juno was not renowned for being forgiving. Aeneas and Dido began to live as a couple. While Dido reigned, Aeneas assisted her by managing her partner's kingdom. But the contemptible goddess Fame spread rumors about the couple's union throughout Libya. The gossip reached King Iarbas, who had been rejected by Dido on the grounds that she would never marry another man again. He had built several temples to Jupiter and knew that the god owed him a debt of gratitude. He called for the supreme god to drive Aeneas from those lands. Mercury, the messenger god, went at Jupiter's behest to deliver the message from the Olympian lord. He ordered Aeneas to abandon Carthage as soon as possible, as his home was not there, but in Italy, the land promised to him by the gods. Aeneas enjoyed living alongside Dido, but he knew it was his duty to establish a new kingdom for his son and people. The Trojan leader commanded his men to make discreet preparations for their departure, so as not to raise suspicions. However, Dido was no fool and spotted the strange goings-on and challenged Aeneas. The queen felt betrayed by him, who planned to run away in hiding after being welcomed by her and acting as if he were her husband. But Aeneas was not swayed by Dido's words, as he had made up his mind to leave for Italy. Aeneas left to help his men finish their preparations, leaving the heartbroken queen behind. Dido ordered a great pyre to be built, as she was about to perform a ritual that would make her get over the love she felt for the treacherous Trojan. Dido proceeded to toss all the belongings she had given to Aeneas into the flames on a platform. To everyone's astonishment, the queen took the sword that had belonged to Aeneas and pointed it at her stomach. She cursed the Trojans and stated that it was the people of Carthage's duty to be eternal enemies of those descended from the Trojans. Having mortally wounded herself with the sword, Dido flung herself into the burning pyre in front of her. The people of Carthage never forgot this harrowing sight. Aeneas and his fleet could even see the great pyre illuminating the night, while hearing the cries of commotion from the Carthaginian people. Aeneas was now heading back to Italy, but he still had to pay a toll in misfortunes for his reckless actions. Having left Carthage behind for a lengthy journey, Aeneas and his people were once again on the island of Sicily, getting closer to their final destination. This time, they would encounter a welcoming village. There reigned Acestes, a king and son of a Trojan noblewoman. For this reason, the Trojans were warmly received in these lands. Juno, however, noticing that Aeneas was about to fulfill his destiny, dispatched the goddess Iris to poison the minds of the Trojans and the elderly who could no longer stand the suffering they had experienced for so long at sea. Before Aeneas could realize it, the women and the elderly had burned a substantial portion of Aeneas' ships, as they wanted to stay there in Acestes' kingdom. The Trojan leader desperately stared at his finest ships burning. But Jupiter would not allow the elders to torch all the ships, threatening them with his lightning and thunder. That night, Aeneas was visited by his father's specter, the old Anchises, who told his son about Jupiter's orders. He instructed Aeneas to gather the strongest warriors and the youngest and healthiest women, for them to board the remaining ships and finally reach the land the gods had promised them. After rounding up fresh supplies, Aeneas set off with his chosen men, leaving behind the old and sick, and the women who did not want to continue. The ones who stayed would find a village named Acista after the king who had welcomed them. Aeneas' trip to Italy was smooth, as Jupiter had had enough of Juno's interference, forcing her to stop disrupting the Trojans' remaining journey. He also asked Neptune to temper the seas, making it easier to sail. Aeneas and his dwindling fleet reached Italy near the mouth of the river Tiber. This region was known as Latium, as the Latins lived there. Once ashore, the Trojans started baking large, flat wheat cakes, and when they used them as a table on which to serve other dishes, the young Asanius said, "We are eating our own tables." The Aeneas remembered the Harpies' curse, saying that they would suffer until they ate their own tables. Aeneas understood that this was the place where the Trojans would settle, as the gods had intended, and these were the blessed lands from which they would raise a settlement to be the seed of the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Not far from where Aeneas and his people had set up camp stood the palace of the Italic people who lived in the region. Latinus was reigning there, an old and savvy monarch descended from Faunus and great-grandson of the god Saturn. But King Latinus never had any male heirs. His only offspring was the gorgeous Princess Lavinia, courted by all the unmarried nobles of Latium. Turnus stood out among the princess's many suitors. He was a strong, good-looking, and powerful warrior, son of the king of the Rutuli. But a prophecy predicted that Lavinia would marry a foreign prince of divine lineage. This outsider and his bloodline would give rise to the greatest empire the world has ever seen and would rule the entire planet. This prophecy meant that Latinus would not permit his daughter to marry, hoping that the husband sent by the gods would finally reveal himself. Turnus resented this situation, as he thought that there was no other man but him capable of leading the Latin people after the old king's death. This was when Aeneas' envoys entered the city of the Latins in a bid for hospitality. They were initially regarded with suspicion by the townsfolk, but the king welcomed them with the utmost hospitality, just as Jupiter commanded. Aeneas' entourage presented itself to the king, recounting all their adventures and setbacks until they finally found their way to the Italian peninsula and reached the spot where the gods had intended them to be. As the king listened to the foreigners, he knew for sure that the Trojan leader was the man the oracle of Phoebus had prophesied. Latinus stated that Aeneas and his men were more than welcome in the land, and that their people must unite in marriage, and he would offer his precious daughter to marry Aeneas, forming an unbreakable bond between both peoples and fulfilling the gods' wishes. He presented the Trojans with splendid horses, and sent Aeneas a divine horse-drawn chariot as a betrothal gift. The Trojans set off to tell their leader the good news. But Juno was enraged when she saw that Aeneas and the Trojans all seemed to have a wonderful destiny ahead of them. But if this was indeed their fate, they would not achieve it without much hardship. The queen of the gods sent for Alecto, the most vicious among the Furies, ordering her to spread hatred, bitterness, and the lust for war in people's souls throughout the region. The frightening Fury proceeded to the Latin palace and found the queen there sobbing, as she could not accept her husband's decision to give the hand of her beloved daughter to a foreigner. Using this anger to her advantage, Alecto slipped one of the snakes the Fury carried in her hair around the queen's neck. The snake changed into an enthralling golden necklace, and its sway made the queen go out into the streets uttering vile words against the Trojans, and hating outsiders always has a pleasant ring to those dissatisfied with them. Having completed the first stage of mission, Alecto took flight to the residence of the powerful warrior Turnus, who was at rest. Using a flaming torch, the Fury ignited Turnus's heart with warlust. The ruthless prince would not permit Aeneas and the Trojans to succeed to the kingdom he thought ought to be his. Turnus commanded his men to prepare for battle, as they would set out for war and only rest after the last drop of Trojan blood had fertilized the Latium lands. There was a wonderful deer in the Latium region, more beautiful than any other, and it seemed that it had formed a bond with Sylvia, a young daughter of the nobleman responsible for the region's shepherds. The deer appeared unafraid of her and happily accepted her petting it. When the Latins caught sight of such a scene, it was their belief that such a sign could only mean that they were blessed by the gods, and the friendship of such an animal was evidence of this. Having seen this, Juno pointed the majestic animal towards Aeneas' son, who was already proving to be an excellent hunter. Asanius was astonished by the size of the deer and yearned to have such a trophy. Asanius shot the animal, wounding it mortally. He and some hunters then followed the deer as it fled towards his friend Silvia's house. Asanio found the deer in agony with Sylvia crying beside it. She exhorted the shepherds who lived there to avenge the death of the sacred deer. They set out to kill Asanius and the Trojans, but they had absolutely no idea that they were fighting experienced warriors, hardened by iron and blood on the battlefields of the Trojan War. News of the sacred deer's death and the avenging shepherds spread throughout Latium. Hatred of the Trojan foreigners spread like wildfire among the Latins. A major war was about to break out. When the hideous Fury poured her poison into the hearts of the Latin people and spread the lust for bloodshed throughout Latium, Turnus brought all the disgruntled people to the gates of the Latin king's palace and insisted that he declare all-out war on the Trojan foreigners. Latinus hoped to escape from this world in peace, but supported by the queen, Turnus secured the endorsement of all the peoples friendly to the Latins. The king worried that the gods would not allow him to die the peaceful death he so longed for. Camilla, the warrior princess who had learned the arts of war while following the entourage of the goddess Artemis, emerged from the Volscian kingdom. She arrived to help Turnus, who was an ally of her people. The king was ordered to open the glorious gates of the Janus temple, indicating that the Latins were at war, but the ruler opposed the command and retreated to his chambers. No longer willing to be lenient, the goddess Juno himself raced down to earth and opened the temple gates with her own hands, much to the rapture of the combatants, who were thrilled to learn that the goddess was on their side. They were convinced that, just as Juno had helped the Greeks defeat the Trojans in the Ilion lands, she would once again deliver another devastating defeat to them. Standing on the banks of the river Tiber, Aeneas brooded over the impossible ordeal the Trojans would have to undergo. Although they were outstanding warriors, the Trojans were only a few and would not stand a chance against the combined forces of the Latium cities. Then Tiber, the river god, emerged from the waters. He told Aeneas not to despair, and that the gods were on his side, except for Juno. He said that Aeneas needed to head to the kingdom of Tuscany, ruled by Evander, a Pelasgian king from Greece. Despite being Greek settlers, they were friends of the Trojans. Aeneas went to King Evander for help. The Tuscans, too, were enemies of the Latins, so persuading them to help the Trojans was not hard. King Evander, already an old man, said he would not be able to fight, but would send his best knights and his son Pylos to lead his men on the king's behalf. Somewhere far away, in the divine forges of Mount Etna, Vulcan, the forging god, was crafting majestic weapons for Aeneas at the request of his wife Venus. These could only be compared to the ones used by Achilles himself. They were given by Venus to her beloved son. She told him that, as long as he wore them, he would be capable of fending off any enemy. The hero sensed that with those weapons and armor he would be almost invincible on the battlefield. But one item struck him more than the rest: his new shield. It contained several high-relief artworks depicting the future of Rome. But all these images were puzzling to him. It featured the twins and the she-wolf, men cradling women in their arms, and many other stories that made absolutely no sense to the Trojan. While Aeneas was out looking for allies, Turnus was paid a divine visit. Iris, the messenger of the gods, brought a note from Juno to the great warrior. It said that, without Aeneas around, the Trojans' camp on the banks of the Tiber was vulnerable. Turnus led his army to it, but the dust stirred up by his army's advance alerted the Trojan watchmen, who sounded the alarm. The leader of the Romans dared the Trojans to face them in the open, but Aeneas's warriors were not foolish and did not give in to Turnus's taunts. They would be waiting for Aeneas to come back before finally standing up to the Latium warriors. Turnus threw his assegai at the Trojan palisade watchmen, but the Trojans took cover behind their fences and trenches. With no other choice, Turnus ordered the Trojan camp to be besieged until more men could be assembled for the final assault. But Turnus grew impatient and paced back and forth, trying to find ways to harm the Trojans. It was then that he gathered his best men and set off, bearing torches, towards the unprotected Trojan ships on the riverbank. Cybele, the mother of the Olympian gods, would not allow Aeneas' sacred ships to be burned. She turned to her son Jupiter and pleaded with him not to allow the wooden boats from her sacred grove to be wrecked. The goddess sacrificed her entire woods so that Aeneas could have his fleet. When Turnus and his men hurled their torches at the ships, they expected the boats to burn quickly. Instead, Jupiter brought the ships to life, and they became magnificent sea creatures. Turnus's men were shocked, as this could only be a sign that the gods were on the Trojan side. But Turnus took the sign differently. For him, the vanishing of the Trojan ships meant that this time Juno would not allow them to flee after their defeat, and they would be utterly exterminated. The commander Turnus and the Rutuli hoped to put an end to the Trojan camp, so they bravely advanced against the enemy defenses, protected by their shields, and attempted to storm the Trojans' fortifications. The Trojans were not many at the time, but their men had battled for 10 years on the Trojan wall against the Greek invaders and were accustomed to repelling assaults by enemy troops. However, Turnus worried the Trojans when he managed to set fire to one of the defense towers, and its collapse was inevitable. Seizing the opportunity of the breach left by the tower, Turnus and his men stormed the Trojan camp. At first, the Trojans' resistance could not hold back the Romans' breakthrough, as their defenses were still blocking more enemies from invading from other sections of the wall. Using his sword, Turnus took the lives of several Trojans. He felt powerful, as Achilles himself would have, if he had succeeded in invading Troy. But the young Asanius would not allow his father's men to succumb to the enemy, and he shot Remulus in the head, killing Turnus's brother-in-law and launching the Trojan counterattack. Emboldened, Asanius longed to lunge forward and kill the enemy commander with his spear, but he was stopped by a hand on his shoulder. It was the god Phoebus Apollo telling him to be content with taking down just one great hero that day, because if he continued fighting on the front line, he would only encounter certain death. Asanius remembered Patroclus, Achilles' fellow soldier who disregarded his friend's advice and met his death head-on at the spear of the glorious Hector. The young prince of the Dardanelles opted to retreat to the rear and let the more experienced warriors deal with the invaders. Turnus was seemingly unstoppable and only slowed his momentum to engage a fearless Trojan named Pandarus. The fight was hotly contested, but Pandarus eventually perished after being struck down by Turnus, who was fighting under Juno's blessing. But Pandarus' demise was not for nothing, as while Turnus focused on fighting the Trojan hero, the remaining Ilion soldiers drove off the rest of the invaders, who ran for their lives. If Turnus had just focused on opening the gates for his army, instead of pursuing glory by challenging champions, his victory would surely have come that day. But the Trojans were now surrounding him. Turnus ran frantically to save his own life, while the Trojans hurled arrows and spears at him. As luck would have it, the invisible god Juno deflected the projectiles. Turnus rushed to the rear of the Trojan camp and leapt into the river Tiber, the Trojans believing that such a desperate act would cause him to drown. Fortunately for the warrior, the god inhabiting the river was a friend of the Rutuli, so he would not let the warrior sink under the weight of his armor and shield. In the dwelling place of the gods, Venus complained to Jupiter that Juno was throwing the war out of balance by helping the native peoples, and that this would tear the gods apart, just as it had at Troy. Jupiter then decreed that the deities would no longer meddle decisively in the conflict, and that it would be up to the men themselves to disclose the fate that the Moirai had planned for them. As he emerged from the water after almost drowning, Turnus spotted that, on the other side of the Tiber, Aeneas was heading back, laden with soldiers from neighboring kingdoms who had allied themselves with the Dardanelles hero to fight against the Rutuli and the Latins. Aeneas was to show his enemies the true price of war by rousing the fury and bloodlust of Mars, the god of war. Having been separated from his allies for a few days, Aeneas had finally arrived back, bringing with him a large contingent of soldiers from different regions who wanted to take revenge on their Latin and Rutuli rivals. However, at the very start of the fighting, Prince Pylos, son of King Evander, perished at the hands of Turnus. Hera, perceiving that the Trojans and their allies' counterattack would be devastating, pulled Turnus away from the action, knowing that the brave warrior would not shy away from facing his enemies and would surely die. Aeneas led his men on the front line and succeeded in protecting his camp's defenses. On the other side, the noble Etruscan Mezentius organized the lines of his allies and prevented them from being breached by the Trojans. But Mezentius was struck down by an assegai thrown by Aeneas. Upon seeing his wounded father withdraw to the rear, the young warrior Lausus was overcome with anger. He launched an attack on Aeneas, who deflected his blows and even warned him to back off. If he persisted, he would find no mercy. But the young Lausus wanted to avenge his father more than anything, and ended up abbreviating his own life as a result. When he watched his son's body being brought back from the front line, Mezentius mourned his appalling fate. Without his son, he felt his life was meaningless, so he jumped on his horse and charged into the Trojan lines in a suicidal rampage. He searched for Aeneas as his target, but he protected himself from Mezentius' attack by using his divine shield. The Trojan hero hurled a spear that wounded the mount of the valiant Etruscan warrior. The animal's body tumbled over Mezentius, crushing him. While agonizing under the weight of his own mount, he begged Aeneas to return his body to his subjects for a proper funeral. Aeneas agreed to his request and dealt him the coup de grace. The Trojans claimed victory that day, and they paid tribute to the god of war, Mars, who favored them that time. Latin envoys asked for an audience with Aeneas and requested a truce for the bodies of the fallen to be collected and sent to their relatives. Aeneas stated that he did not wish to continue fighting, and that he was only defending himself against the Latins and Rutuli, who had declined the alliance proposed by the Latin king himself. If they wanted to avoid the pointless deaths of thousands,
they would have Turnus face him in a one-off duel to reveal the will of the gods. The armistice was agreed, and the Latin envoys left with a good impression of the Trojan prince, sensing that he was a just man who did not wish to shed blood in vain. Another group of Latin envoys were at the court of the famous Greek king Diomedes, one of the most famous heroes of the Trojan War, now living on the Italian peninsula. The veteran of many battles was called upon to help the Latins against the Trojans, but when he learned that they would be his opponents, he quickly refused. Diomedes said that he had already defeated them in Troy, but this triumph only brought misfortune to the Ilian enemies. Agamemnon had been murdered on his return. Ulysses and Menelaus had been lost at sea as they tried to return home, and the Locrian warrior Ajax had been drowned by the gods, and he himself had lost his throne in Argos. The Argos hero told him that the gifts that had been brought to him in exchange for his loyalty should be handed over to Aeneas as a pledge of peace. After all, the gods favored him, and anyone opposing him would only meet their demise. Upon the arrival of the two bands of envoys, the Latin People's Council was convened. Both emissaries shared the outcome of their missions, and, for most of those present, peace between the Latins and Trojans appeared to be the best solution. The Latin king, who had not wanted war from the start, again suggested that the two peoples enter an alliance by marrying Aeneas to the Latin princess Lavinia. The wealthy nobleman Drances also agreed that he would cede a significant chunk of his land to the Trojans in exchange for peace. However, as the assembly was still discussing the matter, the sentries on the Latin walls shouted that Aeneas was near the gates. The Trojan army gathered in front of the Latin fortress walls, waiting for Turnus to come forward to face Aeneas in a one-off duel that would put an end to the conflict. Turnus, along with the Latin nobles and his army, left the fortress and set off to meet Aeneas, already waiting for him. As the sacrifices to the gods were being made, the difference between the two combatants' stances was striking. Aeneas looked tall and confident, while Turnus appeared pale and sullen. But the nymph Juturna, Turnus's sister, urged on by the goddess Juno, sneaked into the lines of Latin soldiers and told the fighters not to put all the responsibility for the city's fate on Turnus's shoulders, and that they were greater in number and could win the battle. Spurred on by the nymph, Turnus's men launched spears and arrows at the Trojans and their Etruscan allies, breaking the armistice. A major battle commenced. Aeneas futilely attempted to stop the hostilities and resume the duel, but the fighters' blood was bubbling, and they could hear nothing but focus on their enemies ahead. It was then that bloodshed began. Aeneas was struck by an arrow fired by an unknown warrior. He was taken to the rear to receive medical attention, while the Etruscan king TROJAN took command. The battle was evenly balanced when the Trojans and their allies were outflanked by Queen Camilla and her army. With her personal guard of Amazon warriors, Camilla blasted the Trojans with her bow. Camilla was killing one Trojan after another with her bow given to her by the hunting goddess Diana. It was not her destiny to survive the battle, however. Camilla was knocked down with a javelin thrown by the Etruscan warrior Aruns. But the goddess Diana would not let the murderer of her faithful friend go unpunished, and the Etruscan was blasted by several arrows from Camilla's warriors, who avenged their lady. In the background, another goddess was shaping the fate of the war. Venus, upon seeing her beloved son in pain from his wound, poured divine ambrosia into the panacea to cure Aeneas's injury. The doctor was astonished when he administered the remedy. The wound quickly stopped bleeding and soon miraculously subsided. Now recovered, Aeneas returned to battle and gathered with his commanders, for he had a plan to change the battle's course. Aeneas split up his men, with one part resisting Turin's forces, while the rest would storm the city of the Latins, which was virtually unprotected. The Trojans easily scaled the walls, facing almost no opposition from the few soldiers left to protect the city. The remaining men were no match for the experienced warriors who had made their name fighting on the Trojan walls. After seizing the ramparts, the Trojans opened the gates for the rest of the army to break into the city. Turnus looked back and noticed that he had been duped by Aeneas's guile, as he saw the smoke columns from the buildings burning behind the walls. When the Latin queen spotted the enemies heading towards her palace, she became desperate, and, overwhelmed with guilt for possibly having caused the ruin of her homeland, decided that she no longer deserved to live and endure the pain of her compatriots. The war between the Trojans and the Latins was approaching its tipping point. The Trojans and their allies had breached the Latin wall. The soldiers were desperately attempting to prevent their city from being taken, but everything seemed to indicate that a great massacre, comparable to that at Troy, was about to take place. It was then that Turnus cried out for all hostilities to cease, for he was there to face Aeneas in a one-off bout. Turnus stated that no further shedding of Latin or Trojan blood was needed. The gods would now reveal their will and hand victory to the winner. Turnus grabbed his sword from his chariot driver and set off to face Aeneas. The Italian peninsula's fate was hanging on the shoulders of these two men, bearing the scars of countless conflicts. The Trojan hero Aeneas, son of Venus, bore on his back not only the hopes of his people, but also the weight of a divine prophesied destiny. In front of him, Turnus, the fierce leader of the Rutuli, epitomized the Italic resistance, driven by his pride and his deep longing to claim the right to the throne. Aeneas had fought the best Greek warriors in his life, even Achilles, and he felt that the strong and resourceful Turnus was on par with the greatest Achaean warriors. Turnus charged forward with untamed anger, forcing Aeneas to remain on the defensive. It was then that, with a powerful strike, Turnus smashed into Aeneas's chest, protected by the divine armor made by the god Vulcan, so sturdy that it made Turnus's sword shatter. Turnus was helpless and at the mercy of Aeneas's spear. Aeneas hurled it, but Turnus, with remarkable reflexes, deflected the deadly projectile in the nick of time. A Latin warrior attempted to hand Turnus his sword, but was stopped by Aeneas's cold blade threatening his neck. Juturna, Turnus's nymph sister, once again stepped in, delivering her father's divine sword to her brother so that he could soak its blade in the foreign invader's blood. Venus snapped when she noticed that yet another divine interference had been made, contradicting the decree of Jupiter himself, who had ordered that the deities would no longer meddle in the fate of the war. With his commanding voice, Jupiter said that, should the gods continue to interfere, the conflict would rage on for eternity, and he was already tired of it all. But Juno was certain that, unless her divine allies came to her aid, Turnus would perish before the Trojan hero. The goddess, who loathed the heir to the Trojan tradition, made one last request of her powerful husband. She urged him not to allow Aeneas to name the place New Troy, and neither to let Trojan culture dictate to Latin customs, a people who had always been so obedient to the gods. Jupiter reassured his wife that the Latin language would not only survive, but would spread throughout the world, as the people emerging from the Trojan and Italic union would be so strong that they would overpower all those who dared to defy them. With no divine intervention, Aeneas's fierce resistance started to tip everything in his favor. Turnus appeared to be losing his grip from exhaustion. Capitalizing on Turnus's weakness, Aeneas hit him with a powerful blow. Turnus was severely wounded and defeated. Aeneas claimed victory, putting his foot on his opponent's chest and getting ready to deliver the coup de grace, when Turnus started begging for his life. Aeneas, having spent most of his life in war, felt a rush of compassion as he was tired of spilling his enemy's blood. However, when he saw that Turnus was wearing Prince Pylos' belt as a trophy, his anger sparked and any sense of mercy melted away as the Trojan prince took the life of his enemy. After Aeneas's victory over Turnus, the Trojans found a new place to call home in Italy, as promised by the gods. Aeneas married Lavinia, daughter of the Latin king, sealing an unbreakable alliance between both peoples. Aeneas became king of the Latium region, and his kingdom was noted for its wisdom and justice.
Prince Ascanius would grow up to be a strong and righteous man, just like his father. He would go on to found the city of Alba Longa, the mother city of the future Rome. He became known to his people by the name of Aeolus, originating the Julian dynasty. Notable figures in Roman history would emerge from the Julian lineage, such as Julius Caesar and Emperor Octavian Augustus, leading the Roman people to their immortal glory.